This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Thanks very much, Laura. Before we get started, I would just like to take a few moments to summarise the main areas we'll cover. Today, as Lillian stated, I would like to examine power and resistance in relation to the French Algerian community, or Pied-Noir, as they've come to be known. This paper will examine the literature of the Neo-Français, or the migrants to the colony from the various non-French Euro-Mediterranean countries. It will focus principally upon two autobiographical texts, which I suspect not many people have read, as they're a little bit dry. Jeune Saison and Saison Violente by Rongbon author Emmanuel Robles. In terms of structure, I will begin with a summary of Robles himself as a writer and also the condition of the Neo-Français. Subsequently, we will turn very briefly to Frantz Fanon's analysis of decolonisation, as offering an account of power within the colonial situation in the form of the infamous dialectic of colonisé. We will then subsequently attempt to problematise this dialectic through the introduction of social hierarchy within the French Algerian settler community. We will consequently examine the literature of Robles in light of Pierre Bourdieu's theories of capital and fields of power. Subsequently, I would like to examine the representation of power relations within this social hierarchy in Robles' work, focusing on the representation of power as a productive force, aligned with the thought of Michel Foucault. Finally, I would like to examine the question of resistance in the light of Michel Foucault's theory of bricolage. Hopefully, this paper will help to rethink this term of Pied-Noir. It will attempt to break down its mythologization and homogenization to the point of being seen as almost a classless imagined community. I'd just like to thank you for your attention for the next few minutes and hope that you find something of interest. So here we have just a picture of Robles himself to start off. Robles was a native of Oran and has been somewhat marginalized in terms of criticism compared to other more recognised Pied-Noir authors such as Camus, as we just heard all about, or Hélène Cixous. This is in spite of his relatively prolific output, and he was quite commercially successful and was elected to the Académie Goncourt in 1973. As a French Algerian author, Robles' work distinguishes itself in its understanding of identity within the colonial context. Indeed, rather than attempting to forge a sense of pan-Mediterranean identity, as in the case of other Pied-Noir authors, such as Gabriel Ducio or Camus himself, or other members of the École d'Alger, Robles embraces his condition as a Spanish subject in the Algerian city. This principally is drawn out in the two texts we'll examine today. So, we'll start off with Jeune Saison, which, while it's the deeply nostalgic memoir of Robles' childhood in the colony, presents an interesting vision of the liminal and new conceptions of community created in the social space of colonial Algeria. We will then subsequently turn to the auto-fictional Saison Violente, which presents the political awakening of a young protagonist based very heavily on Emmanuel Robles' life in colonial Iran, and his presentation of social injustice, both in terms of colonial racism and in terms of social inequality within the European community, inherent in the colonial system. So both Robles' texts draw out the condition of the Neo-Français, those Europeans in the colony of non-French descent. These non-French migrants to the colony had initially been seen as a sort of foreign threat, despite attempts at assimilation in 1889 through the naturalization law, which stated that children of the Neo-Français automatically became French citizens. Indeed, they remained part of a distinct community well into the 20th century, which was referred to in Pied-Noir as somewhat polemical, les Français d'Algérie, as an ambiguous French community. This cultural specificity has been described by Jonathan Gosnell as a colonial scale of Frenchness, and indeed Robles' work focuses on the attempted assimilation and production of French identity within these communities in Algeria. His focus in terms of the Neo-Français and migration is very much entirely Spanish, just given the practical geography of Spain's proximity to Oran, and specifically Andalusia's proximity to Oran. So to begin, I would just very briefly like to examine the groundbreaking analysis of the colonial situation by Frantz Fanon, I'm sure most people have heard of. Fanon identifies in Les Damnés de la Terre a fundamental divide at the heart of colonial society between two words, that of the colonizer and the colonized. However, with all due praise to Fanon's analysis, this dialectic of colonisé has, in my opinion, served to homogenise Pied-Noir, or European settler community. Indeed, in line with his somewhat poetic style, les dames les préteurs, Fanon states, ce ne sont ni les usines ni les propriétés, mais quand on banque qui caractérise d'abord la classe de région, l'espèce de région, et de voir celle qui vient d'ailleurs, celle qui ne ressemble pas aux autres. So, this statement, for me, and as Fanon explicitly goes on to pronounce, rejects the possibility of any form of Marxist analysis or any consideration of class in terms of the European settler community. And whilst I think it would be somewhat ridiculous to deny the fundamental crack in colonial society, I believe this statement has somewhat homogenised the European settler community. Indeed, through such perspective, they have come to be known, and crucially to refer to themselves through the usage of the all-encompassing term Pied-Noir. This term, in my opinion, presents the French Algerian settler community as a single, sort of homogenous entity. However, with its focus on the condition of the neo-Francais and social hierarchy within the French Algerian settler community, Emmanuel Robles' work problematizes this myth of the Pied-Noir. The presence of social inequality looms over Robles' portrayal of colonial Iran. Indeed, whilst his work highlights the condition of the disenfranchised Arabo-Berber population subject to the humiliation of the colonial system, Robles also draws out the complex relations within the various European populations in the colony, presenting an analysis of French Algeria which is much more complex than Fanon's bisection of colonised or colonised. The Robles' texts present complex social hierarchy. However, this presentation of social hierarchy does not exist simply in terms of an accumulation of wealth between the Grand Colon and Petit Colon or Petit Blanc. Rather, Robles' vision of social stratification is seen to resemble the thought of Pierre Bourdieu, in particular the theories of the forms of capital and field of power. For Bourdieu, I'll just briefly summarise if that's possible, all social formations are structured by way of a hierarchically organised series of fields. Within these fields, social agents jostle for positions based upon the accumulation of capital. However, rather than simply wealth or economic capital, Bourdieu posits that there exist other forms of various field-specific capital, in what he terms symbolic capital. Crucially, these differ from economic capital or wealth, and they're presented as being of intrinsic worth or recognised as legitimate. This social stratification and the differential distribution of the forms of capital is keenly felt in the work of Robles. Through an examination of Robles' text in light of Pierre Bourdieu's theories of the forms of capital, there's a quite clear social hierarchy to be drawn out, rather than simple, as I said, petit colon, grand colon relations. This is presented in the various interactions between Emmanuel, of neo-Francais descent, and other children who are from similar economic circumstances. For example, in Jean Saison, Emmanuel and neo-Francais are referred to as les 50%, as in 50% de Français. They're seen, despite their relatively similar economic stance, to inhabit a position which is much lower in the social hierarchy, and in spite of various hyper-nationalistic outbursts of status anxiety, be that in the form of racism, anti-Semitism, or even their very much emphasised presence in every military procession, they're members of, as Robles argues, a much lower social caste. This social stratification is most obviously drawn out in Saison Violente, when the apartment Emmanuel shares with his mother is earmarked for demolition, and he's sent to live with one of her wealthy clients, Madame Cummings. Cummings is presented as the epitome of the Grand Colon, at the apex of the social hierarchy within the colony, and she's seen to possess a monopoly of economic capital from a very lavishly decorated apartment and huge amounts of land in the countryside, but also symbolic capital. This position as a member of the dominant class of the Grand Colon, due to accumulated capital, serves to provide Madame Cummings with what Bourdieu terms the acquired disposition of taste. Indeed, this dominant class is shown to establish and mark difference by a process of what Bourdieu refers to as distinction, land on a network of oppositions between elite culture and mass culture. Indeed, thanks to this taste, Madame Cummings is able to identify gaps in Emmanuel's education, and thus the patron of the neo-Francais takes it upon herself to forge what she refers to as un garçon comme il faut, attempting to teach Emmanuel the proper way of living qui définissait un plan si éloigné du mien. Emmanuel's social education often serves to reiterate these grossly differentiated distributions of the forms of capital within colonial Europe, and is often taken to a sadistic level, reduced to this very oral maxim, comme il faut, synonymous with this part of capital. Thus, in trying to befriend Veronique, the daughter of Madame Quinson's neighbour, who is a haute fonctionnaire in the colonial administration, Robles is informed that he is not comme il faut, both in terms of economic and symbolic capital. Thus, despite Emmanuel's initial attempts to follow the advice of Madame Quinson, Neo-Francais is firmly placed into the Colonisé category of fan and social bisection, from the perspective of the Colonial, and to a certain extent from the perspective of the Français de Souche. Thus, Neo-Français is labelled as un vrai sauvage, comme si elle s'était sur-aperçue puis j'avais les dents limées selon la culture de certains cannibales. Indeed, from such a perspective, the Neo-Français is very much framed as Defoe's Friday to the Crusoe of the Colonial, who is charged with the civilizing mission to enlighten not only conquered populations of Arab and Berber, inhabitants of the vast majority of Algeria, but also anyone who is not a Français de Souche. However, whilst the methodology of Bourdieu can be seen to facilitate this demythologization of the idea of a classless population of the Pied-Noir, and the question of power relations and the reproduction of social relations within this hierarchy remains to be examined. Whilst this reproduction of social relations in terms of between colon and colonisé in the colonial situation has been explored in very much a large amount of detail. In terms of the reproduction between European populations, this has been somewhat critically marginalised. However, it is keenly felt within Robles' work. Power is presented as multifaceted within the European community in Algeria. At once it is presented in line with the thought of Louis Althusser and seemingly takes the form of a repressive force from a very, very Marxist perspective, serving to maintain cultural hegemony and to manufacture consent. This is drawn out in various autoderivative statements by sort of the adult narrator Robles reflecting on his very much focused reflections on his education. Indeed, on l'œuvre, he states, sans y avoir jamais mis le pied, c'est sur cette ville beaucoup de choses. Nevertheless, Robles' presentation of the function of power within the European community of French Algeria is not simply limited to this repressive vision of producing cultural hegemony. Indeed, both texts allow the reader to observe a productive vision of power, showing the functioning of the processes David Prochaska refers to as making Algeria French. Indeed, Robles draws out the function of power as demonstrated by Michel Foucault in the form of discourse, highlighting what Foucault refers to as the regime of truth within colonial Algeria. Both Saison Violent and Jean Saison highlight this general politics of truth, that is, the types of discourses which are accepted and made function as true, through a focus on accepted discourse. These accepted discourses are perhaps most evident in Saison Violent, when Emmanuel is interviewed by a generically named Homo Canoptier, who is shown to be the epitome of colonial administration. The accepted political discourses permeate this interview, such as the idea of the fundamentally dishonest Arab Berber or communist, and various witnesses' statements are discredited through phrases such as ce communiste, dis-tu vu que je me fie à ce type. These accepted discourses are further highlighted in Robles drawing attention to his mother's use of the term Arab, which, in line with contemporary usage, refers to all non-Europeans. Whilst presented innocently in Emmanuel's mother's speech, it takes on a much more malicious tone in that of the Colonial, Madame Quinson, who for her is an explicit attempt to refuse to acknowledge any individuality of the colonised and to present them as a sort of dehumanised mass. Crucially though, this attack on names, which is a poignant issue in the colonial situation, given the part of the name is very much the preserve of the white male colon, is also carried out upon the Neo-Francais. The Madame Quinson suggests various orthographic changes to Robles' name, suggesting that he should add a grave accent to the E to appear more French rather than Spanish, and thus presents a sort of point of contention between Republican discourses of assimilation for the European populations, but also the marginalising discourses of the colonial situation. These discourses allow for the most productive vision of power as part of a disciplinary society to be traced out through the establishment of normalization of judgment. Indeed, the visions of norm and deviant are observable in Robles' presentation of Colonial Iran. There is a sharp distinction drawn between the associations of French culture and the associations of Spanish culture, which for French it's very much seen through the universalizing gaze, the mission civilisatrice, compared to the superstition-laden Spanish culture of the Neo-Francais. This is perhaps most evident in the childish stories Emmanuel and his friends recount in the classroom. Indeed, Emmanuel and a friend recount a very much exaggerated story of having seen a skeleton in a warehouse, but both boys, whilst making these exaggerated claims, have a very sort of specific language they use. And for the duration of the story, the skeleton, forgive my Spanish, is only referred to as calavera, and very much associated with the superstition and the supernatural, whereas the French is explicitly omitted from this, and in turn forms part of the rational language of knowledge, common to the anatomical study of the human body, and as Robles goes on to emphasise, the livre des sciences. Consequently, Spanish culture is thus shown as a source of shame for the Neo-Francais. However, whilst Robles does draw attention to power relations within French Algeria, he doesn't completely close the door to resistance. Following our examination of the division of power presented by Foucauldian reading of Robles' work, it would be expected that the Neo-Francais would simply absorb this cultural hegemony within the colony that Robles goes on to describe as omnipresent. If this were the case, it would be expected that the Neo-Francais, through a process of simple mimicry, would fall victim to what Homi Bhabha terms partial presence, that is, existing as an accepted form of otherness. Indeed, such a view of the condition of the Neo-Francais is argued for by Peter Dunwoody, who states that this mimicry of cultural hegemony is shown to accentuate the condition of the Neo-Francais, where to be Francophised emphatically not to be French. However, we'll now attempt to examine a question of resistance to this, drawing on the thought of Michel de Certeau. Indeed, whilst there's clear cultural hegemony present in Robles' Oran, he attempts to echo Marie-Louise Pratt's assertion that while subordinate people do not usually control what emanates from the dominant culture, they to varying extents control what gets absorbed into their own and what it gets used for. This simply leads to a process of transculturation for Robles' 50%. Indeed, this dynamic approach to hegemony, as presented in Robles' Oran, forms part of the processes Michel de Certeau describes as bricolage. Indeed, de Certeau proposes that rather than unquestionably absorbing the products of cultural hegemony, subjects make innumerable transformations of and within the dominant cultural economy in order to adapt it to their own interests and rules. This appropriation of the products of French hegemony is clearly presented in Robles' vision of the Neo-Francais, and indeed this clearly Spanish community is shown to bricoler as a means of resistance. Thus, despite a clear valorization of French culture and the hegemonic dominance of the Grand Colon, the everyday practice of the Neo-Francais presents a form of resistance to this form of power in the form of bricolage, such in the transformation by Emmanuel and his friends of various sort of symbolically noted place names. Indeed, Place Hoche, named for the Napoleonic General Hoche, is referred to by the neologism Place Hoche, and Écu, the site of a major battle fought by Napoleon against Austria, into Écomu. These transformations crucially present a form of resistance to hegemony, inscribed in the French city through the omnipresent Pied-Noir, instead presenting a relativization of Napoleonic glory. This emphasized relativization of French glory is continued in the description of General Hoche, seemingly presenting his memorial relevance to everyday practice. Through its description as verdâtre et pièce de feuille, the bust of the general is shown to hold little relevance to everyday life within the place, and is subsequently described as complètement abruti par le pentamère des tonneliers. Due to this lack of relevance to the practice of the inhabitants of Oran, the place itself holds much more of a geographic significance, being reclaimed from the discourse of memorialization through these various oral neologisms, which, through their orality, serve to detach any relation between the place and written French history. Indeed, these forms of resistance at the level of everyday practice are shown to form part of a clear Spanish community within the European settler community in French Algeria. Indeed, as a counter-influence to the influence of Madame Pinson's mission civilisatrice, Manuel focuses on his grandmother, representative of another influence, that of Spain, and specifically Andalusia. In a manner similar to Madame Pinson, Emmanuel's grandmother is seen as a figure of authority, yet she is described as an uncontested and true authority. This embodiment of Andalusia is treated with solemn respect, referred to only as vous, solely addressed in Spanish, and importantly acts as a maternal counterbalance of Madre, compared to the very much hegemonic domination of Le Patrie. Robles draws out Neo-Francais' own code de politesse, which is shown as unique and leads to a distinctly Neo-Francais system of values, as embodied in his much emphasised separation of the sexes in childhood. Robles describes this as part of the plus sérieux tradition idéalique, and separation is shown to be enforced by all male members of the Neo-Francais community, who are very much keen on intervening if these codes are transgressed. Thus, in conclusion, the French Algerian settler community can be seen to be presented in the work of Robles as distinctly more complex than the simplified or homogenized term of Pied-Noir. Whilst the repatriated Français d'Algérie gradually became known under this term of Pied-Noir following the 1962 exodus, Robles' work somewhat undermines any such homogenization, presenting a clearly heterogeneous settler population. As can be seen from the examination of Robles' texts, there is a clear social hierarchy within the European settler community in relation to the Neo-Francais and a complex set of power relations. However, resistance to this is also presented in the form of bricolage and the appropriation of the products of French cultural hegemony through daily practice. Crucially, however, as the Certoist asserts, this appropriation through bricolage does not lead to what could be termed an oppositional culture, but rather resistance is both a preservative and a creation of something new. It offers a different and pluralized account of power. Such a pluralized account of power would tentatively allow us to rewrite Fanon's dialectic of coloniser in the plural, in conjunction with the work of scholars such as Baba and Spivak on the work of the colonized, that is, as coloniser. Thanks.